You stop. My name is Barry Feldman. The first thing I have to ask you to do is turn off your cell phones, because there's a very intricate system here, and if you don't turn it off, you're going to be connected to the congregation's Wi-Fi, and you will hear the news of last week and the week before, and what may occur next week. So I'm suggesting that, and I'm requesting that you turn off your cell phones. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a congregant at Zarua, and I want to welcome all Zarua congregants and all advocates of preservation, represented by the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation and the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, and everybody else who is interested in preserving very important New York. I'm glad we're filling up. There'll be a few speakers before we see this wonderful documentary, The Golden Age of 2nd Avenue. But I have to make a few special acknowledgments. One is to Helene Santos, the lady who's standing there, who was assumed the burden of putting this together after I suggested it and went away. So I really am very appreciative to Helen, to Helene, and to her staff, to Anthony, who is not here, but who provided all of the technical assistance that we're going to need for tonight. There is a secondary agenda that we have, besides acquainting you with this wonderful period of the Yiddish Rialto, which lasted from about 1885, when Boris Tomaszewski, a 15-year-old, someone said a 15-year-old pisher, meaning this young kid who had an awful lot of nerve, decides to put on the first Yiddish show, which turns out to be a flop, but it inspires Yiddish theater, which remained very, very vibrant into the late 40s, early 50s. And still there are productions that are going on all the time. You may know that Fiddler on the Roof is being made into a Yiddish production, directed by Joel Gray, and there's a lot of very positive hype about that. So what I'd like to do is just turn over the microphone to Harry Bobbins, my friend from the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. I'd like to mention that a few times. Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, Preservation in the City, who will talk a little bit about the film, about our work on the Jewish Rialto, and introduce you to some folks who are intimately connected to the film and to the Yiddish Walk of Stars. So Harry, you're on.
Thanks a lot. I'm Harry Bobbins. I'm the Special Projects Director of Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, and this indeed is a very special project. We want to showcase this film tonight by Morton Silverstein, the Emmy Award-winning documentarian that takes a look at and showcases Yiddish theater in America up to the 60s from its start. And we're honored to have Rita Silverstein, his widow, here tonight to speak and introduce it. She will also be available with our other guest speaker I will soon introduce after the film for some questions and answers, and I know some of you also have some tales of your own to share, I heard, coming up to this event. So we want to show this film to also draw attention to the Yiddish Theater Walk of Fame on 2nd Avenue, in front of the famed 2nd Avenue Deli, installed by Abe Lebewohl. And although unfortunately the Deli and Abe are not with us, the walk is still there, and it's a quite unique installation of art, of culture in our city, and unfortunately it is in need of preservation and protection. Just last year there was some sidewalk work by the DOT that fortunately we found out about and were able to stop the destruction of more than one of the plaques, with one of the 32 plaques with the Yiddish stars that Abe was very fond of was cracked. And so they've been suffering wear and tear over the years. We have a flyer out front on the table. We have a petition that we're working on some preservation efforts, and we formed the Friends of Abe Lebewohl Yiddish Theater Walk of Fame stakeholder group to work on what is going to be the best path forward for it. So to speak a little bit more about that, and before Rita introduces the film and we have our questions and answers after, is tonight I'm going to introduce Sharon Lebewohl herself. Little round of applause. Even before the intro. So Sharon is a restaurateur, a lecturer, an author, a movie producer herself in her own right. She is the co-author of the Second Avenue Deli, the cookbook, recipes from the famed Second Avenue Deli, and she also produced a DVD called A Sabbath Meal in the Kitchen with Sharon Lebewohl and Mike Burston. Sharon.
I'm not going to read this whole book. My name is Sharon Lebewohl, and I'm the proud daughter of Abe Lebewohl. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you for a few minutes. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you for a few minutes about my father's life and ultimately his love for the Yiddish theater. My father was born in Lebewohl, Poland in 1931 to a comfortable middle-class family. His briefly secure life was shattered when in 1939, when my father was just 8 years old, Stalin joined forces with Hitler, Poland was divided, and Lvov became part of the Soviet Union. A year later, my grandfather, Ephraim, owner of a small lumber mill, was condemned as a capitalist, arrested, and sentenced without trial to 10 years hard labor in Siberia. The business was seized by the government, and a week later, my father and grandmother, forced to leave all of their possessions behind, were taken to the railroad station, herded into cattle cars, and deported to Kazakhstan in Central Asia. Thousands of miles away, in Siberia, my grandfather was put to work as a logger, enduring long hours balancing on rolling logs in freezing waters. A fall from the logs, not an uncommon occurrence among prisoners, meant instant death. Before a man even had a chance to drown, he'd be crushed by the oncoming logs. It was a job for a young athletic man in excellent condition, not a middle-aged businessman, debilitated both emotionally and physically by cold, hunger, and despair. My grandfather later told my father that his intense desire to reunite with his family focused his concentration and kept him from falling to his death. Similarly, my grandmother, devastated by the soul-numbing loss of everything she held dear, and unsure if she'd ever see her husband again, had to rally immediately in order to survive. She found work in a restaurant and sent my father to a local school. When school let out every afternoon, she'd hide him in an inconspicuous spot in the restaurant and sneak him food while he did his homework. In 1941, fate favored my family. The Russians granted amnesty to all Polish prisoners, and my grandfather was released from the labor camp. A fellow prisoner he had befriended in Siberia, future Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, wanted my grandfather to accompany him to Palestine via Iran. But my grandfather's first goal was to find his family. By the time he located my father and grandmother, it was too late to get out of the country. My family had to remain in Kazakhstan until the end of the war, scrounging at odd jobs to keep food on the table. Unbeknownst to his parents, my father resorted to stealing cigarettes and selling them on the black market to help keep the family alive. When the war ended, they returned to Lvov to see if they could find any of their remaining family alive. Everyone, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and friends, had been killed by the Nazis. There were just a very small number of surviving Jews. They survived either because they were hidden by Gentiles or they hid in the sewers until after the war. Ironically, my grandfather's arrest and his family's forced deportation had saved their lives. My family was sent to Waldenburg, a new territory the Poles had reacquired from East Germany when Europe was reconstituted after the war. After years of absolute horror, my family enjoyed a brief respite from danger. But when 8 months later, after the war had ended, 40 Jews were killed by Polish anti-Semites in a bordering town, my family decided to leave Waldenburg and settle in Palestine. Since the British were allowing very few Jews to enter, it was necessary to immigrate illegally. My family made their way to Italy, where they planned to board a ship to Palestine. At the last minute, however, my grandmother had a change of heart. After being the only members of her family to survive the Holocaust, she couldn't risk her own son's life in the Israeli fight for independence. My grandfather agreed, and despite protests from my father, a Zionist, my family decided to stay in Italy until they could emigrate to America. For several years, they were forced to reside in a displaced persons camp in Barletta, Italy, under the auspices of the United Nations. In 1948, my grandmother gave birth to my Uncle Jack in the DP camp. My father was 17 and had spent more than half of his life fleeing persecution. My family remained in the DP camp until 1950, when they were given the opportunity to come to America. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society found them housing on Lafayette Street in Manhattan, in the building that is today's Joseph Pabst Public Theater. My 19-year-old father, desperate to make a success of himself in America, immediately began to teach himself English. His teacher, also a greenhorn, but one who had arrived a few years earlier, tried to pass on the rudiments of American culture with the language. He told the class that all Americans chewed gum and were fanatical about baseball. So my father chewed gum and memorized baseball stats and lore. A more realistic view of American life came from his reading, dictionary in hand, of every page of the New York Times. This was a habit that lasted a lifetime without the dictionary, with the addition of Polish and Yiddish newspapers as well. My grandfather found a menial job polishing display fixtures in a factory, and my grandmother went to work for a necktie manufacturer. Both my grandparents wanted my father to go to school, but he wanted to make a life easier for my grandparents, especially since they had a baby to care for, so he insisted on working. His first job was in a Coney Island deli, where he was employed as a soda jerk. During his lunch breaks, he volunteered to help out behind the counter, where he could better observe the restaurant's operations. He soon graduated to coveted counterman. Over the next few years, he worked in a number of other deli kitchens, learning the secrets of superlative pastrami and other traditional Jewish delicacies. In 1954, at the age of 21, with just a few $1,000s he miraculously managed to set aside, my father took over a tiny 10-seat luncheonette on East 10th Street. Working around the clock for years, often filling in as cook, waiter, busboy, and even dishwasher, he put all his time and energy into making a success of his tiny establishment. When he started dating my mother in 1957, my father told her that he owned a restaurant. She didn't believe it since he was so young and he had just arrived in America without knowing a word of English. One day she traveled from her Bronx home to see if it was true. When she walked in and saw him sweeping, she thought he'd lied to her. Only after she asked someone who the owner was and he pointed to my father did she believe that the restaurant was actually his. For the first decade, the entire enterprise was touch and go. Bankruptcy often loomed. When money was tight, my father often moonlighted at other jobs to keep the restaurant going. He frequently despaired that he was taking in less money than the dishwasher. In 1958, he took the plunge and married my mother. I was born in 1959, please don't do the math, and my sister Felicia was born in 1960. Having a family that depended on him made the precariousness even more anxiety-provoking. However, it also strengthened his determination to succeed. Like my grandfather on the logs, he somehow managed to stay afloat. In the early decades of the 20th century, 2nd Avenue between Houston and 14th Street became a cultural hub lined with Jewish bookstores, cafes, and theaters. Every night, stars of the Yiddish stage appeared in melodramas, comedies, and serious theatrical productions. Even Shakespeare was adapted for the Yiddish stage. Edward G. Robinson, Steve Lawrence, Paul Muni, Leonard Nimoy, and Joseph Papp all began their careers in the Yiddish theater. My father hadn't been exposed to the Yiddish theater yet. His life during the war had been about surviving, and his life in America had been about supporting his family. He chose downtown 2nd Avenue as the site for his restaurant because he treasured the neighborhood's Jewish heritage. The Yiddish theater was already on its wane when he opened the Deli. The old Café Royale had been on 2nd Avenue and 12th Street, and it was the meeting place for Jewish entertainers and intelligentsia. Charlie Chaplin, George Jessel, Fanny Brice, Eddie Cantor, and Rachmaninoff were just a few of the people that hung out at the Royale. My father thought that he would honor the Yiddish theater by naming his restaurant the Royale Deli. But the owner wanted a $2,000 royalty, and that was like asking my father for $2 million at the time. He named the restaurant the 2nd Avenue Deli, but the idea of honoring the Yiddish theater lay heavy in his mind and heart. Once my father opened the deli, the stars that were left in the Yiddish theater on the Lower East Side started coming in. My father got to know Jack and Seymour Rechtsite, Miriam Cresson, Zvi Schooler, and Lillian Lux. He heard their stories, and he cemented his desire to honor the Yiddish theater. He became great friends with the Barry sisters, Mike Burstyn, Iva Schwinkel, and others. In 1973, my father took over 2 stores adjacent to the deli and expanded. In 1978, he acquired an adjoining store and created the Molly Picon Room, honoring the great Yiddish actress. "You have a theater named after you," Molly once said to Helen Hayes. "Well, big deal. I have a room in the 2nd Avenue Deli." The Molly Picon Room was filled with posters and photographs of the actress, many of them signed by her. As a tribute to Molly Picon and the other actors and composers of that era, my father embedded Hollywood Boulevard-style stars in the sidewalk outside the restaurant in 1983. The sign in the window read, "This star-studded sidewalk was created to immortalize the great actors, actresses, and musicians who graced the stages of the 8 Yiddish theaters that once flourished along 2nd Avenue." My father once told me that he began this project because many of his young customers would come into the Molly Picon Room, see the plaque with her name, and ask if she was the one who financed the room. He wanted to bring more attention to the history of the area. There were 31 granite stars commemorating 58 luminaries of the Jewish stage. On the star next to Molly Picon's is the patriarch of the Russian-born Boris Tomaszewski, who in 1882 brought Yiddish theater to America and the non-English-speaking Jewish immigrants of the Lower East Side. Unfortunately, my father forgot one important friend and customer, Iva Schwinkel. My uncle corrected this in 1997 after my father's death. Now Iva Schwinkel has a star of his own. Iva died 2 years ago, and the only living actor with a star is Mike Burstyn. In 2006, Mike and I made a cooking video together. It's called The Sabbath Table. The Yiddish Walk of Fame is part of my father's memorial. As many of you already know, my father was brutally murdered on March 6, 1996. He left behind a wife, 2 daughters, and 5 grandchildren. He now has 11 great-grandchildren. The best and most significant memorial to my father is the thousands of deeds of loving kindness he gave. Most will probably go unheralded because he did them without fanfare in the truest sense of charity and sharing. All the elderly, poor, and hungry people that my father fed for free are his memorial. Thousands of children in religious schools and public schools who celebrated the holidays because of his generous contributions are his memorial. The hundreds of charitable causes, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that my father contributed to unselfishly and anonymously reflect his memorial. His concern for his employees, both on a personal and professional basis, was truly limitless, and further stands as his memorial. His open hand and kind word to everyone he met are again his true memorial. The hundreds and perhaps thousands of people my father touched are a living memorial to a very special human being. The 2nd Avenue Deli at 156 2nd Avenue closed its doors in 2006 due to a rent dispute. Although my uncle and cousins reopened the deli at a different location, the granite stars remain in the sidewalk at 2nd Avenue and 10th Street, in front of a Chase Manhattan Bank. It would break my father's heart to see the condition of the stars now. Most are broken and faded, and the names can no longer be seen. As a memory of my father, Jewish life on the Lower East Side, and the Yiddish Theater, I pray that they can be moved to a location where they will be repaired and taken care of.
If anyone's interested after, I have a book with pictures and plaques and the names of the actors who are on it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Malkins. I'm with the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, and if anybody wonders why anybody concerned with the Bowery would be at this event, it's because the first American home of Yiddish Theater was on the Bowery beginning in the 1880s. There were 4 theaters on the Bowery: the Thalia, the Windsor, the People's Theater, and also the London Theater that had thousands of seats. Thomas Shevsky and Jacob Adler and many other performers made their mark there. I'm very honored tonight to introduce Rita Silverstein, the widow of Morton Silverstein. And just to tell you a little bit about Mort, he won 8 Emmys, no small feat, and he was also one of the first American reporters to interview Fidel Castro and report back into America about the Cuban Revolution, which is pretty impressive as well. When I was asking Rita earlier about how many Emmys Mort had got, she said 8, and I was quite amazed by that. I didn't know it was that many. And she said, "Oh, they're great. I work out with them." I also wanted to acknowledge Mort's daughter, Erica, and son-in-law, Stephen Lombardo. They have 2 lovely grandchildren that could not be here tonight, and just so happy that they're here. Rita, take it away.
Sometime during the John Lindsay administration, Mort was approached by Channel 13 and Arthur Cantor, who at the time was the executor of the Blue Rose Foundation, to do a documentary on the Yiddish Theater in New York. Along with an exceptional crew that included Esther Enza, a researcher at the Museum of the City of New York, Esther was able to locate archival film, posters, photographs, and newsprint from Vivo, the Institute of Jewish History, and Jewish Forward, and the museum itself. At that time, there was one Yiddish theater in New York on 2nd Avenue. Having never spoken or understood Yiddish, Mort and I decided to see the film. We rented translation earphones, sat on lovely red velvet seats, and viewed the movie. The earphones worked well for a while until I tapped Mort on the arm to tell him that I was suddenly receiving police calls. Overhearing this, the lady seated to my left turned to me and said, "Darling, you don't need those earphones," in a volume at full throttle. She would tell us what was happening on the screen. No one around us seemed to object at all. I don't recall the film, but I do remember the overwhelming joy of the audience upon hearing Mama Lucia, the mother tongue. I hope you enjoyed it as much as they did. Thank you.
I
had meant to hold this up, and I'll walk down. This is a photograph of Morton.
Q&A. I know we're having a wonderful work evening, and David wants to share something.
Yeah, I meant to say in the beginning, if anybody's interested in getting a DVD of the Golden Age of 2nd Avenue, you can look it up. I'm sure just Google it, but Sisu distributes the DVD.
Great. So, are there questions from the audience? I have a few I can prompt as well, or if Sharon or Rita want to share something that was piqued by the film today.
It's always lovely to see this film. I watch it all the time. I wish Mort was with us too. Is it on? It's on. I wish Mort was with us too. Like this? Did you hear me breathe? Very close, Rita. I wish Mort was here to see it with us. He enjoyed doing this as much as he adored any of the investigative documentaries he ever did. He would have liked tonight very much.
I just want to say that I've seen it about 10 times. The first time with my father, but I enjoy it. I enjoyed it tonight as much as the first time. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
I just wanted to say that Herschel Bernardi has two beautiful daughters. One is named Robin, and the other is named Beryl. She is named after his father, Beryl Bernardi. They are not at all in theater, but they're very charming. They both live Midwest, very relaxed, lovely young women.
Talk about the son who took over for Tevye.
Oh, yes. Oh, Rita reminded me. I'm so sorry. I was thinking about his two daughters. But he also has a son who is a performer. And in fact, was the, what do you call it? The substitute when Star can't make it? What do you call it? Understudy. Thank you. I didn't get that. The understudy in Tevye, the recent revival of Tevye, several evenings, and he wore his father's boots when he performed the role, because his father had performed it. Here we used another actor who performed it named Harry Gause, who Sheldon Leonard, who was the lyricist, preferred in the role, actually, he told me. But Bernardi was fabulous, as you can see. He was fabulous. And now his son is taking on his roles. So there we have it. Anybody else?
Are they hoping to restore the Star Walk or replace the stars?
Either one, but they'll probably have to be replaced. They're in really bad disrepair. You can't, they're broken, you can't read the names. I mean, I have some pictures from many years ago, and I can see the names from that, but you can't read them. We're trying to figure that out now. That's one of the options.
Does anyone know, maybe in the room, what's going on with the Hebrew Actors Union in East 7th Street? I mean, last time I was there a couple years ago, the building was still in use. And I know it's in the historic district. It protects the facade. Does anyone know what's going on inside it?
David knows.
I was able to go in there last year sometime, and they are trying to get major funding to restore it, and they eventually would like to have a performance space in there, which would be absolutely fantastic. So if anybody would like to make a contribution, we can put you in touch with
The building is really a wonderful treasure of Yiddish theater. You have this large room, and you have all these wonderful portraits of past performers that are there. Until about, I guess, 5 years ago, there was a yearly dinner commemorating Yiddish theater and just commemorating Yiddish language. But it's no longer really a viable place for it. Maybe it's not safe, I'm not certain. So the Yiddish theater group, the union, at one time there were almost 400 Yiddish actors and actresses. I understand you're not supposed to say actors and actresses anymore. Everybody's an actor, including me. At one time, there were almost 400 actors belonging to the union. And so there is still a yearly gathering commemorating their memory and work, but it's no longer held in the East 7th Street building. It's held at Sutton Place Synagogue on 51st Street. But it's a wonderful building, and it contains wonderful memories, and it really should be saved.
I think the gentleman in the back.
Aaron?
How was the Catskill Mountains associated with the Second Avenue theatrical organization? Was there an interplay between Second Avenue actors and performances on the Catskills?
Ma'am? I just knew you would answer the question. I can't possibly think that the Catskills didn't have Jewish plays, Yiddish plays. It just doesn't seem possible that they could have overlooked the Catskills. That's a good question. Yeah.
This is an area of total ignorance to me, so this is great. The question I have is that obviously the focus is on Second Avenue, but was that a burgeoning that happened when people immigrated to New York, or was it something that was transposed from Eastern European countries to New York? You see what I'm saying? Was it a large culture first outside of the United States, or did it become a larger culture?
Well, there was a large culture in Europe at that time. Okay. And when they came here, they observed the same groups.
Okay. Thanks.
I'll just try to, I do better saying, I'll just try to flesh out the response to that. Yiddish theater begins in the 1870s in Europe, but not here. In the early 1870s, you don't have that Eastern European population. So it begins in Europe in the 1870s. Tomaszewski, who was a young boy, 15, 16 years old in the 1880s, knows what's happening in Europe. And he is in love with the theater, and he wants to create Yiddish theater here. Yiddish theater grows as Eastern Europeans come to the United States. Jacob Adler, who is like the father of Yiddish theater, he doesn't come here. He comes from Eastern Europe to England because when the Tsar is assassinated, Alexander II, one of the corrections or punishments that are imposed upon Jews who are accused of killing the Tsar, although there were 7 assassins and 6 of them were not Jews. So Yiddish theater is closed in Russia, is my point. So Jacob Adler and others go to England, and then you have the great migration to the United States, and that's when Yiddish theater really begins in the 1880s and 90s.
Thank you.
But it's already flourishing in Europe.
Yeah. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah.
Somebody in the back had a question.
I don't have a question, I just wanted to say, when I saw Terrence Hirschbein being shown briefly, I worked with his son for 5 years at the 92nd Street Y, Olmus, who I haven't seen in a long time. I like to think he's still with us, but he was my connection, and I heard, stories from Olmus. I saw Greenfields. It was a very rare but popular story at that time about a yeshiva bucker who wanders into a farming family that happens to be Jewish, and the story involves him there. But I feel like it was a blessing for me.
That film was made in New Jersey, not Eastern Europe.
Has this ever been, or can it be on PBS?
It was.
When?
44 years ago. Before it was called PBS, it was called NET, National Educational Television. It was broadcast there.
But not recently. Is there any way to, it's such a wonderful film, is there any way to get it, for one of their fundraisers?
Call them. Let them know you're in.
Remember, it's you. Remember he said,
That's right.
It's you.
Ergo Media has a lot of this stuff.
Say again?
Ergo Media,
Ergo?
Dr. Eric Goldman,
Oh, Eric, yeah, okay, yes.
I think he calls it something else now.
Okay. He's an expert on Yiddish theater and Yiddish movies.
He didn't change the name of the company, but he carries a lot of these.
So the name is Eric Goldman. You can Google him. Please.
Yeah. I just want to thank all of you for coming. You probably could tell me some wonderful stories that I don't know. But it was a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it. I think you did. I kept looking at faces. And again, thank you very much.